Hey Alex, Tommy Givens here. Great to be working with you again, man, in a New Testament course, Romans this time. And just thought I'd send you a reply video here in week one. Gives me a chance to say hello a little more directly and also give you some feedback on what you've written in both of the discussion forums, which is excellent, by the way. Love the kind of probing, questioning you're doing. So keep up the good work. With Habakkuk, I especially like how you are holding together the righteousness of God and the righteousness of the human in a kind of symbiotic relationship. So often this is reduced to something contractual, we human beings do our part and then God does God's part. That's not really fitting what's happening in Habakkuk or in Romans. Instead, um, Habakkuk learns from God that God is trustworthy, not because of what human beings will do, but because of who God is. And so I think you're right, if I'm inferring from your post here in Forum 1, that when Paul says the justice of God is revealed from faith to faith, he is describing what in Habakkuk is the faith of God that produces the faith of the human in response as a kind of fruit of God's own faith. In other words, in order for the human to have faith in God, God must act in good faith. God must be reliable, trustworthy. And so it's in that sense that the faith of the human actually discloses God's own faith, God's own faithfulness. And those really go tightly together. And I would say that that reaches a kind of fullness in the Messiah, in whom the faith of God and the faith of the human are one person. And it's the faith of this life, the messianic life, that is then spilling out to people like the non-Jewish audience of Romans, people from among the Gentiles, as Paul describes them, who are being baptized into the Messiah and expressing the obedience of faith that was promised the son of David, who would inherit all the peoples of the world. This plays out very practically in Romans. It plays out in the way people in the community treat their enemies, learning to love them in the same way that God has loved the audience while they were enemies of God. It plays out in the way they share the table with each other, learning to be generous with one another in the same way that God has been generous with them. So this is how the faith of God and the faith of the human are in a kind of dynamic relationship, and then sort of in its eschatological, I would even say, fullness in the life of the Messiah that is spilling out into the world through the spirit of resurrection. So good stuff here in Forum 1 about Paul's use of Habakkuk. And in Forum 2, you're getting at the kind of pre-existence question, predestination, election. This is definitely a theme in Romans, so I'm glad you're just kind of flagging it here. We want to keep thinking about it. It reaches a kind of really intense pitch at the end of chapter 8 and then all through Romans 9 to 11. But it is thematic to the whole letter, as I think you're implying, because the gospel of God that Paul is the apostle of is something that is the fulfillment of the work of God throughout the history of Israel, and you might say kind of inscribed into the whole of God's plan for creation. Now, when we think about election or predestination, our minds often go to some kind of moment of origin or pre-origin, where we're trying to figure out in the beginning or before the beginning why God did what God did. And I understand that impulse, but I think that that is different from the way that Paul presents being set apart, the way Paul presents God's election, God's predestination, because it's not so much about speculating about God's reasons for doing this or that. Instead, it is recognizing from the present that we are the fruit of something that was set in motion long before our own generation, our own circumstances, and then reading our own life in the light of what God has done to bring it about. So the election of Israel as God's chosen among all the peoples of the world, the election of the tribe of Judah, the election of David and David's dynasty, finally, the election of Jesus as son. These are not things that we can sort of make sense of by referring to some blueprint of God's plan from before the foundation of the world. Instead, we can make sense of them by sort of reading the prehistory of what has taken place by the light of what has taken place. So, if God has raised Jesus from among the dead, this requires us to look back at the way Jesus lived, the way Jesus died, the history of his life intergenerationally, with a new kind of appreciation for what God had been doing. Same thing with David. Part of the reason David is understood to be chosen by God, him and his kind of bodily future over generations, to be the kingly dynasty over the people of God and finally all the peoples of the world, is how David's life played out, how David's memory continued after he died, the hope that was associated with his name, uh, who would sort of claim his mantle in the world. Same with Judah, same with Israel, etc. So election or predestination to me is always a retrospective claim about how God has worked, and therefore what God has predetermined, you might say, or predestined from before the moment in which we're trying to make sense of what's going on in the world. That's a little different, I think, than just speculating about sort of what God's intention is at the beginning of things. It's more trying to make sense of how God has done what God has done. More we can talk about there. I do think that that is compatible with a measure of free will, but it will be a measure of free will that itself is always unfolding within the purpose, the shaping of God. And that is different often the way we think about free will, which is usually something that is totally unaffected by God. And that I don't think is really available to us in light of who God is by the presentation of Scripture. God is the God who gives life to everything that breathes. And therefore, God is always involved in everything that we do. We can't imagine that God sort of like withdraws God's presence in order for us to be able to exercise free will. Free will, you might say, is a way in which we are participating in God's presence in the world. Anyway, more we could say there. Feel free to reply to this video if you want. No pressure to do that, though, if you don't want to. If you don't want to reply with anything, at least maybe write me a one-word received or something like that so that I know that the video came through okay and you're able to view it. But most importantly, Alex, just glad to be in conversation with you and want to commend you on some good work here in week one in both discussions and looking forward to more conversation ahead. Oh, I think if I recall, you are in the area, the Pasadena area, so just look for the group that is going to be meeting every Friday, starting this Friday at 3 p.m. And that's going to replace the second forum discussion every week, and hopefully will give us a chance, those of us who are in the neighborhood, to be able to have some in-person conversation about what we're studying in Romans. Thanks again, man. See you soon, I hope.